Chapter 2. My original plan was to start back up in the Gospel of Mark this week. However, with me being sick last week, and then I was visiting family for Christmas for the last several days, I didn't really spend any time in the office, which means you get to hear the sermon that I was supposed to give last week. And so we're going to finish up our series of An Awkward Family Christmas. And I know it may not feel like Christmas time anymore, but that's okay because we're talking about the wise men who technically weren't actually present at the Christmas story. So therefore, it's okay if I do it well after Christmas. So this morning's sermon is entitled Bad Gifts. I got a confession, I don't like receiving gifts. I feel really awkward when people give me things. I hate the idea of people spending money on me. I try to live a very simple life, and I don't like having material things in my life unless I have a specific use case for them. And when I do, they're usually very specific things that I want, and I don't like it when people give me stuff. But sometimes you open up some gifts, and it's just like, what do I do with this? I have a twin brother. His name is Justin. I love my brother very much, but he gives the strangest gifts. Every year, he hands me a box with wrapping paper on it, and I'm like, oh no. What is it going to be this year? The weirdest one he ever gave me was I opened it up, and it was a mega pack of wet wipes. I didn't have kids at the time. And I'm like, Justin, what am I supposed to do with this? He goes, oh, once you use those, you'll never go back to regular toilet paper. And his wife's just standing behind him. I'm sorry, I didn't know that's what he was getting you. I'm so sorry. I'm kind of curious. I would like some crowd participation. Any of you, what's the weirdest or worst gift you've ever gotten during Christmas? Somebody yell something out. There's got to be something good in here. I'm expecting it to be like a wife embarrassing her husband from what he got. So, Dawn, what did Mike get you?
No, 1 year we did, steal a gift.
Yeah, a white elephant gift?
White elephant, and Mike got a plunger.
You got a plunger? Nice. Hey, that's useful. And I stole that rat. And it's currently hiding in my kid's dresser. All right, so this morning we're going to look at the gifts that were brought to Jesus, and how at first glance they seem like some really odd gifts to bring a baby, but when you examine them closely, there's actually a lot of symbolism in the gifts, and kind of foreshadowing the life and ministry of Jesus. So we are in Matthew chapter 2. We covered most of Matthew 2 a couple weeks ago when we talked about King Herod and the impact that Herod's decisions had on Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus. And so this week we're going to kind of basically go through Matthew 2 and talk about all of the parts that we skipped over during 2 weeks ago during that last sermon. So Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, and we already covered him, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. So I want to take a moment and talk about who were these wise men. So unlike what the song that we sing and that they play on the radio, these men were not kings. Wise men were actually advisors to the kings. So just like today, how our president has a cabinet of people around him, right? So the idea is that the president doesn't have to be an expert in every single issue. He just has to surround himself with people that are, so that when he has a problem, he can turn to those people and seek advice on how to handle whatever situation arises. In the ancient world, worked pretty much the same way, that they would have these council of wise men that they could turn to whenever they needed. Now, the actual word that's used here in Greek is magi. And magi is where we get the English words of magic and magician from. In that these men were not just like smart advisors, but these were magicians, or you could even translate it as sorcerers, that they would basically turn to their gods and seek guidance from the gods so they could advise the king. Think of like Jafar from the movie Aladdin. That's basically what we're talking about here. And so many of these magi would practice different disciplines, such as astrology, which is basically looking to the stars and the movement of the stars in the planets in order to they thought that the gods were speaking to them through those things. Things like divination, like literally talking to the gods, fortune telling, sorcery, necromancy. All of these things, by the way, are condemned in Deuteronomy 18 as abominations. And also, when I say that they were like seeking help from their gods, you have to realize that ancient people weren't stupid. They knew that like these idols in front of them were just like statues or wood. But there were actual spiritual entities behind those idols that they were worshiping and that they were communicating with. By today's vocabulary as Christians, we would put those entities in the categories as demons. When we think that like these ancient people were just so stupid and they were just worshiping these empty idols, it kind of makes the entire idea of spiritual warfare pointless when we just try to explain away these beings that these other people were worshiping. Some examples of these magi or wise men throughout the Bible would be Genesis 41, when Joseph was able to interpret the dream of Pharaoh that Pharaoh's wise men failed to do. We see Exodus chapter 7, where Pharaoh's wise men were actually successfully able to replicate some of the plagues that Moses had brought onto Egypt, right? Those were all magi, the same type of category. And then the most famous wise man in the Bible was Daniel. The entire book of Daniel is about how he was taken from his home and he was trained up to become one of these advisors to the king. And he actually served under 3 different kings as one of their most trusted advisors. And what made Daniel stand out from all of his peers is while they were all trying to use astrology and all of these things to communicate with their false gods, Daniel prayed to the one true God who gave him the wisdom in order to do his job as well as he could. So these wise men were probably from the same kind of lineage, right? The same profession that Daniel had some 400 years earlier. We're also told that they were from the East. Right? Again, the songs, literally every part of the Christmas song, We Three Kings, is inaccurate. Every single part of it is just wrong. But I've torn that song apart in the past, so I'm not going to go into that again today. But it says that they came from the east, literally from where the sun rises. And we're like 90% sure that this, again, was not like Asia, like we normally think of, but it was Persia, which is modern-day Iran. Again, one of the same kingdoms that Daniel served under some several hundred years before. So again, this is who the Magi were. They were basically sorcerers and astrologers from a faraway land in Persia. And so they came to Jerusalem, verse 2, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and came to worship him." By the way, another misconception about this story, the wise men did not follow the star to Jerusalem. it says they saw the star, right? These guys tracked the movement and the positions of the stars for a living. And so they saw this sign in the heavens, right, in the night sky, and they knew it was time for the king to be born. So when they saw the sign, they picked up their stuff and they left, and it would have taken them a long time to get from Persia to Israel. And so they show up, and what's the most logical thing to do? Well, we know we have to go to Israel, so let's go to Jerusalem. And so that's why they arrive and they speak to King Herod and say, right, we saw the sign, and we know that the king of the Jews has been born. And so Herod didn't know anything about this, and so he goes and asks his advisors, his wise men, right, what do the scriptures say about where this Messiah is supposed to be born? And so they start flipping through like, oh, it says in Micah that he's going to be born in Bethlehem. So Herod tells them Bethlehem, and then of course, again, we already covered that story about how Herod's going to try to trick them, and he wants to kill the baby and everything. But if we pick back up in verse 9, it says, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, I want to talk about what exactly is this star. Because, again, it's possible that these men they may have been familiar with the Jewish scriptures because of Daniel, right? That maybe he handed his scriptures down to these people, and if he was such a big deal at that time, then perhaps the people that came after him wanted to study what made Daniel so good, and so they studied the scriptures. And in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel pretty accurately predicted when the Jewish Messiah was going to come. And then you combine that with, in Numbers 24, a prophet named Balaam said, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Like, well, that seems pretty specific to this situation. So perhaps these wise men just simply knew the Jewish scriptures. They connected the dots there, and they were watching in the stars, and they saw something that said, now's the time. Now's the time that what Daniel predicted has come true. And so maybe the stars were just a means of keeping track of time. However, in verse 9, it says that the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Right? So at this point, the star literally does lead them to the city of Bethlehem and then just stops and parks right over Bethlehem. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever looked at the stars at night. That's not what stars do. Stars don't move to a certain location and then just stay there, which tells us that maybe this wasn't just a star. Maybe there is no natural explanation for this, which means that we have to turn to a supernatural explanation. So perhaps what they saw was actually an angel, right? Angels are often described as looking like bright lights. Angels are often referred to as stars at multiple places throughout the scripture. See Revelation chapter 12. Another explanation is that maybe what they saw was the Shekinah glory, the glory of God going before them like a light, such as what led the people through the wilderness in Exodus chapter 13. But ultimately, we don't know what this star was. Again, lots of people have proposed different guesses, but that's all that they are. We're not given enough information in the text to say for sure. The one thing we can be sure of is that God revealed himself to these men in a way that would bring these specific men to this specific place at this specific time. Right? And it's also really weird when you consider the fact that these men were essentially sorcerers and astrologers. They practiced a profession that was forbidden by God in the Old Testament, right? Because God said to his people, right, don't look to the stars for answers, look to me. And yet, he revealed himself to these men in the stars. And so it seems really strange But essentially, what we have is God revealing himself to people in a way in which they will receive it. And God has done this all throughout history. A modern day example of this would be in the Muslim world. They place a lot of emphasis on dreams and like receiving visions from dreams, and they think that Allah speaks to them that way. And so there are thousands of stories of missionaries having Muslim people running up to them. It says, I had a dream last night where I saw Jesus, and then I saw you. You need to tell me about this Jesus. Again, that God reveals himself to people in ways in which they are ready to receive it. And I think that is ultimately what is going on here with these wise men. So they follow the star to Bethlehem. And in verse 11, in going into the house, again, they're not in the manger anymore, right? This is some time after. It would have taken them a long time to travel all the way from, right? They would, when Jesus was born is when they left from Persia. They had to travel all the way to Jerusalem and then find Bethlehem and come to the house. And they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream to return, or not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Right? So they bring these gifts to this baby. And the gifts are gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, I have 2 kids, but I'm no expert in babies. Also, not a big fan of baby showers. I don't know, whoever recently came up with this idea that men need to go to baby showers too needs to just stop. No. Right. Also, I'm no expert in the ancient customs, whether it be in Israel or Persia, as to what an appropriate gift to bring a baby is. But I think pretty much universally, regardless of what continent you're on or which century you live in, I think there's some pretty safe bets like blankets, clothes, toys. These men bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I don't know what a baby's going to do with those. I don't, baby Jesus is just sitting there gnawing on the gold as he starts to teeth or something. It seems like a really odd choice for a baby. But yet, there's a lot of symbolic significance to each of these gifts. So I want to talk about that for a moment. So the first gift is gold, one that we're probably all familiar with. Gold is a precious metal that signifies wealth and power. Throughout all of history, gold has been used as a currency and has been recognized as being very valuable. And gold is something that you would bring a king. And so they came to worship this new king of the Jews. And so the gold was symbolic of Jesus being our king. The next one is frankincense, not Frankenstein, frankincense. Frankincense was a perfume that was made from a very specific resin that, according to Exodus chapter 30, was actually used by the priests during certain burnt offerings, where they would put the frankincense with the offering, which would make this incredible aroma that would rise up to God while they performed the sacrifice. So the frankincense is representing Jesus' priestly duties. And that Hebrew says that Jesus is the perfect high priest, right? And that it is because of Jesus that we are all priests, and that he is the mediator that allows us to go directly to God, and that we don't have to offer burnt sacrifices anymore because Jesus fulfilled that for us. And the last gift is myrrh. Myrrh, also made from resin, but this one of a tree specifically found in Arabia, which meant that it was very hard to come by and therefore very expensive. And it made a spice that was used in embalming bodies, right? That when they would make bodies and they'd wrap them up in cloth and they would pack the bodies with myrrh to kind of help with the decaying process so it didn't smell so bad. Also, when Jesus was on the cross and he cried out that he was thirsty, it says that the Roman guards who were there actually took sour wine and they mixed it with myrrh, and that's what they put on a sponge and offered Jesus to drink while he was on the cross. And then after his death, his body was taken down by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and they prepared his body to bury him using myrrh. And so myrrh has, it signifies the bitterness, suffering, and affliction that would foreshadow the cross. So in these three gifts, we see three of the functions that Jesus is going to perform. That Jesus is the king, he's the King of Kings. That Jesus is the high priest, according to Hebrews in the order of Melchizedek, which I don't even know exactly what that means. That's a whole can of worms that we're not going to open today. And that he was, as Isaiah would refer to, the suffering servant. That not only did he come to rule, but first he came to die and to suffer for our sins. Because again, there's a lot of symbolism packed in here. And all of this, again, is foreshadowing the ministry that Jesus is going to have. And so what Matthew is doing here by showing that Jesus is being worshiped by these wise men is he's setting up Jesus as our king. All four of the Gospels read slightly differently, and that's because all four of the Gospels have their own kind of agenda. They have their own purpose for writing. And Matthew's purpose specifically is that he is trying to present Jesus as the king of kings, and that he is the only one worthy of worship, and he is the only one that we should bow down before. We talked about this back in chapter 1 when we read through the genealogy of Jesus and how Matthew and Luke actually record different genealogies. And the reason for that is that Matthew is trying to show that Jesus is in the line of King David and therefore is worthy to sit on the throne. And then we see an awful lot of irony here because the actual king of the Jews, Herod, was oblivious that all of this was going on until the wise men told him. But these Gentiles from a far-off court came to worship him. That these men who were used to royalty, right, that these men sat in front of the king every single day and advised him on how to rule his kingdom, and who were oftentimes used as ambassadors to go and deal with kings from other lands and establish relationships with other kingdoms. And that these men would take their time to travel all the way and come and worship a baby. And so Matthew is lifting up Jesus as the king. And there's a lot more symbolism here as well when you consider the fact that Jesus was rejected by his own people, that Herod, the king of the Jews, would try to kill him as a baby. And then some 30 years later, Herod's son, Herod Antipas, would have a hand in actually succeeding in what his father set out to do in executing Jesus. And yet it's the foreigners, it's the Gentiles, it's the people that the Jews excluded were the ones who would actually receive Jesus as their king. Right? And so all of this it's foreshadowing what Jesus came to do, that Jesus came to rule as a king, he came to be our high priest, and he came to suffer on the cross for us. Typically, we normally do communion the last week of the month. However, with me being gone last week, we decided to bump it back. So at this time, I would like to ask